Hi there, my name is Jane Prescott and I've been preparing students for the IELTS test for many years. And I've also been working for an IELTS test day centre for over 5 years. So I've had the opportunity to see firsthand how candidates approach the exam and also what common mistakes they make. I'm really looking forward to sharing my knowledge and experience of the test with you over the next hour or so during this masterclass. And this masterclass is brought to you by IDP, proud co-owner of IELTS. In this masterclass, we're going to focus on the first part of the academic writing test, Task 1, giving you all the tips and tools you need to improve your Task 1 writing score. We'll practice analysing some different types of questions, go through the 3 key things you need to do when answering them, and take a look at the very specific vocabulary and grammar you need to use. We'll also go through the marking criteria for Task 1, so you know exactly what the examiner is looking for. And in the final part of this masterclass, we will cover some do's and don'ts for this part of the test. Did you know that worldwide, the average band score for writing is 5.5? And if you ask examiners what is the one thing candidates could do to improve their overall score for writing, what do you think they'd say? Improve their grammar? Learn more words? Well, yes, these things are important, but examiners would actually say candidates can improve their overall writing score by understanding how to write a Task 1 answer, which, if you think about it, is fairly obvious. If you score badly in Task 1, it will bring your overall writing score down. So why is this? Perhaps because it's only worth 1/3 of the marks. It is often part of the test that is neglected by students, possibly because they are complacent. They feel it's not as important as Task 2, so they spend more time and more effort practicing essay questions. Certainly, when I start a new IELTS course, my students often say they are more worried about Task 2 than Task 1. Often, students practice some of the Task 1 questions, but not the less common ones, like writing descriptions of processes and maps, so they get unstuck when they face one of these on test day. Another common mistake is students not learning the technique to answer a Task 1 question, which is important as you only have 20 minutes to do the task. I often see students on test day spending too little time on Task 1 because they have concentrated on Task 2, or they take ages writing their answer to Task 1 because they haven't practiced the techniques and don't leave enough time for Task 2. With practice, it should be easy to write a Task 1 answer in less than 20 minutes because of the standard structure. We've tried to make the session as interactive as possible, giving you some exercises to have a go at yourself before our feedback is given. So at any time, feel free to just pause the presentation for as long as you like. Also, please download a copy of your Masterclass pack if you haven't already done so. All the sample tasks are in there, as well as your banding descriptors sheet with some pages with essential vocabulary and grammar.
The session is led by CJJL Associates, who are English language teachers with a number of years of experience teaching IELTS courses in different countries and of producing resources for English language teachers and students. They are myself, Celine Castellino, Jane Prescott, whom you've met, Jenny Roden and Laura Plotnick-Jones. You will be hearing from Jane and myself in this masterclass. You will also hear from Dawn Oliver. Now let's see our masterclass advice for the writing part of the test. Now for writing, and for both formats, academic and general training, there are 2 tasks you have to complete in an hour. If you're doing academic training, the Task 1 question consists of writing an academic-style report summarising information presented in a visual format, whilst Task 2 is an essay. Firstly, the information for Task 1 may be presented in a number of different visual formats. Secondly, the task is essentially an information transfer task. In other words, the information which you're given in a visual form as a picture has to be converted into text. I tell my students to imagine they're talking to someone on the phone who can't see the visual, and they have to describe accurately what is on the picture. Try to give your answer so that the person on the other end of the phone could draw exactly what you said. As we said in the introduction, you should only spend 20 minutes on this task, as it only counts for 1/3 of the total marks. You will lose marks if you write less than 150 words. But will you get more marks if you write more than 150? The answer is no. I advise my students to write between 150 and 180 words maximum. Any more than this, and you won't be reporting the main features, you will be wasting time when you could be working on task 2 and potentially make more mistakes, so lowering your score in grammatical range and accuracy. To help you recognize what 150 words looks like and to save time in the test counting words, I suggest you download a copy of a blank answer sheet to practice writing your answers on before test day. Here are some examples of the different type of charts from task 1 that you might be asked to describe. A table, a pie chart, line graph, bar chart, and lastly a map and a process chart, which are less common than the graphs or tables and charts, but they do come up occasionally. If you're preparing at home, make sure you've practiced answering all of these different task 1 questions at least once. In this masterclass, we are going to be discussing in detail how to answer a question with a bar chart and line graph, and also giving you tips on how to answer the map and process questions. Lastly, although there are a lot of different visuals you could be given, don't panic. You always have to do the same 3 things. 1, summarize. 2, report the main features. And 3, make comparisons. In this section, we're going to take a closer look at how your writing is assessed and what the different marking criteria mean to help identify the writing skills you need to achieve Band 7 or higher in the test. You might want to have a look at the writing band descriptors in your pack, as we will be referring to the sheet in more detail in parts of the masterclass. So over to Don.
So how are you scored in your writing? Well, you'll find in the assessment criteria that you have in your pack that there are 4 columns. The examiner does not look at your writing and say, oh, that is a 6. The examiner says you are a 6 for this criterion, you are a 7 for the next criterion, you are a 6 for the next criterion, and maybe a 7 for the last criterion. You may be very good in some parts of your writing, but you may need to improve other parts of your writing. Today, maybe I can help you work out where you are strong and where you are weak in your writing. So the first criterion is called task achievement. It simply means that you are able to answer the question directly and fully. In fact, that you understand the question. So this is the first thing that you have to be able to do. It's 25% of the mark. The next criterion is called coherence and cohesion. What does that mean? Coherence means that you are logical, that I can follow your argument, that I can follow the task 1 description, that I can follow what you are saying in your general training task 1 letter. How do you do that? It's about using paragraphs in a logical way, by introducing and then leading on to the next paragraph, which leads on to the next paragraph, and then concluding in a logical way. And cohesion means that you are using words that connect your ideas. Words like so, but, on the other hand, however, moreover, in contrast, besides that, as well. These are the words that the examiner is looking for when he or she is assessing this criterion. So use these words, and when you read, look for those words. In lexical resource, you are judged as to how well you can use vocabulary, right? It doesn't mean that you have to use very unusual words like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious or something like that. No, no, no. It means being able to use words in a natural way. Where do you find those words? You find them when you read, okay? And finally, you are judged on your grammatical range and accuracy. I think we understand accuracy, right? It means you can use English tenses correctly. I go, I will go, I went. It means you can use prepositions in, on correctly, plurals. You can use that correctly. But range is another matter. What does it mean? It means this. The examiner wants to know if you have some complex, more complicated sentences that you can show them. I'll give you an example. I'll tell you about my favourite food, right? Cheese. I love cheese. It's quite cheap. My family likes it. I buy it every week. It's healthy. Every sentence was perfect English, perfect grammar. What score do I get? For writing, for my grammatical range and accuracy. Maybe a 6. Why? It was perfect grammar. It was perfect grammar, but every sentence was a simple sentence. I like cheese, the simplest sentence in English. Subject, verb, object, right? But listen to this. I like cheese because it's good for you, and besides that, it's quite cheap, which is great because my family likes it, so I buy it every week. Wow. If they could, they would give me 10 for my grammatical range and accuracy because I have connected those ideas into one longer sentence. Now, you don't have to make very long sentences, but you need to show the examiner that you can make a longer sentence, a more complex sentence. Where do you find them? What are you going to do tonight? You're going to read a newspaper? Read a news magazine? Do that and you'll find those sorts of sentences.
So that's what you're assessed on. And in the next section of this masterclass, we are going to use these criteria to analyse a model type 1 answer. But before we do this, I want to remind you about what we discussed earlier. Timing is everything in the writing part of the test. When practising in class, I make sure my students stick to this time plan, as it means they don't miss out on a vital stage. Stage 1, understand the question. What is the topic of the graph, table or chart? What do I have to write about? Is there any key to the chart? And what is on each axis? This should take you 1 to 2 minutes. Stage 2, really important. Plan what you are going to write. Locate significant data and information and identify the overall trend or main point. This should take you about 3 minutes. Then stage 3 is write your answer, which should take you about 12 minutes. And lastly, don't forget stage 4. Check your writing. This should take you about 3 minutes. You need to check for content. Have you answered the question? Check your vocabulary. Have you used a good range of vocabulary? And check your grammar and spelling. And also make sure you check your presentation. Have you used paragraphs? And is your writing clear and also easy to read? So here is a typical question. And you have a copy of this in your masterclass pack. This question is asking you to describe 2 related graphs. It's about Japanese tourists travelling abroad in a 10-year period. 2 charts often come up in task 1, so you need to be prepared to answer a question with 2 charts. So what do you think? Does the information look fairly straightforward? Are you tempted to start writing straight away? Well, don't be. Remember our time plan earlier. Before writing anything, you need to read and understand what your graphs are showing. Now, obviously, as teachers, we all want our students to analyse the question and plan before writing. But for task 1, it really is critical. Please don't be one of those candidates I often see on test day they, in the heat of the exam, open their papers and start writing straight away, only to spend the majority of the next 10 to 15 minutes erasing much of their answer because they haven't analysed the question properly before they start to write. So how do you analyse a question quickly? These are 7 helpful questions you could use. If you want to give yourself some real-time practice, pause the presentation and try answering these questions in 2 minutes. The first question, what kind of chart is it, is really important. In order to know how to do something properly, it's necessary to understand the purpose of that thing. Is its purpose to show trends over time, like a dynamic chart, as in this example, in which case you'll need to use vocabulary and grammar to describe trends? For example, the number of Japanese tourists travelling abroad grew steadily. Or is its main purpose to compare and contrast information? If so, the information could be presented in a static chart, like a table or pie chart, or it might be on the line graph with several lines on it. With this, you will have to pay attention to varying your grammar and vocabulary to make comparisons and express in contrast. For example, there were more Japanese tourists travelling to Australia than Europeans. So here are the answers. Did you manage to get them in 2 minutes? The good news is that I don't expect you to remember all 7 questions because they can be summarised as what, where, and when. All my students want to know what structure should they use. Well, for task 1, there are 3 rules to follow and 3 things you need to do. The first is write an introduction. The second, write the main paragraph highlighting key features with figures. And lastly, you need to write an overview, which you can do at the beginning after your introduction or at the end. So let's show you how, starting with the introduction. So as with any writing task, you have to set the scene for the reader and provide a context, which simply means tell the reader what you are going to be writing about. It sounds easy, but arguably it can be difficult, and this means your whole task 1 starts badly. So what should you include in your introduction? Well, the first thing to note is what you don't do. Writing about tables, graphs and diagrams is not the same as writing an essay in IELTS Writing Task 2. Did our question ask you to give your opinion and say why Japanese visitors came to Australia? No, it asked you to select and report the main features. Actually, the main purpose of the introduction is to let your reader know what the graph is about, as well as where and when it takes place. So here is the sample introduction from a model answer. Do you think it is a good introduction? Hopefully you'll say yes. This is a good introduction because it includes the important information from both the bar chart and the graph. It says what they are both about, i.e. the number of Japanese who spent their holidays overseas and the proportion of them who visited Australia. It also says when, from 1985 to 1995, and it also states where, Australia. So what else do you notice about the introduction? Does it repeat the words from the question in the introduction? No. It's important that you try to use your own words in the introduction. If you copy the same words for the question, these words will not be counted in your 150-word total for task 1, and you will also be marked down in the vocabulary section of the assessment criteria. So what we're talking about here is paraphrasing the question, which means using synonyms or words with the same meaning, so you avoid repeating the words in the question. So let's compare the language in the question with the language in our sample introduction. How many changes can you see? Pause the presentation if you want to have a go. The answers are highlighted. Did you find them all? So here are some tips to help you paraphrase the question. You don't need to change everything. You can simply make changes by adding words. For example, the graph becomes the line graph. Or you can use words with the same meaning. Holiday means the same as vacation, spending instead of expenditure. Or you can change the way the sentence is written. For example, Australia's share of the Japanese tourist market becomes the proportion who visited Australia. 2 very simple ways to paraphrase a question are 1, by changing your first sentence, the chart becomes the chart compares, or you can change the time period. Instead of saying between 1985 and 1995, you could write from 1985 to 1995, or you could write in the same period. Here are some useful expressions you can use to change your first sentence, so you have showed the examiner you can paraphrase the question. Okay, so let's move on to the next stage in your Task 1 answer, which is writing the main body paragraph. The first thing you need to do before you start writing is to make sure you have found the key features of your graph, chart or table. This can be difficult as graphs and tables usually present a lot of data. And if you describe every single detail, you can create a list which sounds mechanical, and you will receive a low score in task achievement because you won't have summarised or reported the main features. So your essay will be accurate but not relevant. I suggest my students circle the 3 or 4 things that stand out to them on their question booklet. Things that you should look out for include the highest and lowest numbers. Check to see if there has been a substantial growth or decline in a particular category. And look for 1 or 2 categories which break the pattern set by all the others. The next thing you have to do is group the data. Grouping data means looking at each of the categories in the graph or table to see if you can organise them into groups. This may seem difficult if there are a lot of different categories, but they can often be put into groups that increase or decrease, or put in groups that are similar. Lastly, you need to think about how you're going to organise your answer. For a dynamic chart or graph, you could write from the most significant to the least significant. You could write in the order of time, or you could write in the order it is presented in the graph or table. With a static chart, you could write your answer from the highest to lowest, from the lowest to the highest, or in the order it is presented in the graph or table. So what 3 or 4 key features would you choose to write about? And how would you organise your answer? Have a look back at our sample task and compare this with our answer. Pause the presentation if you want to do this. As you can see from our description, we have chosen 4 main trends to write about. Would you have chosen the same ones? Don't worry if not, there's no right or wrong answer. The important thing is that you don't write about every small detail in your main paragraph. Also, would you have chosen to write about the data in the same way, chronologically, from the beginning to the end of the period? So let's look about how it is written. Is it easy to read and follow? Hopefully you agree that our paragraph is. This means that the coherence and cohesion is good. Firstly, this answer is coherent because of the way in which the information has been ordered, in a chronological order from the start to the finish. Secondly, if you look at the words in bold, in 1985 and 1990, or at the end of the period, can you see how these time markers are being used to introduce each new trend? And these make the paragraph cohesive. So let's have a look at the second main body paragraph. Because this task has 2 graphs, it's important you write about both. And to keep your answer cohesive and coherent, you need to write a separate body paragraph for each graph and table. In the previous slide, we saw how the use of time markers made the answer flow. Well, here are some more examples of signposting words. For example, turning to introduces the description of the second graph. But what about the other words that are highlighted? What are they doing? Similarly is being used to introduce a trend that's the same. While is introducing a different trend, and but is being used to contrast specific data. So moving on to the second rule of writing, which is using data to highlight the main trends or features in your main body paragraph. IELTS considers that being able to do this is a key writing skill. You need to show that you're able to back up your facts with evidence. Just how well you can do this is rated under the column that is called Task Achievement. So here's an exercise in using the band descriptors for writing. Pause the presentation if you want to have a go. The question is, what is the highest score for task achievement you can get if you don't include figures to highlight the key features? So the answer was found in the first column under task achievement. Will you get a band 7 if you don't include data when you report the key features? No, because band 7 says, clearly presents and highlights key features. What about a band 6? No. Again, we can see presents and highlights key features. So if you don't highlight your answer with data, the answer is band 5. You have to go all the way down to band 5, which says there may be no data to support the description. So to recap, rule 1 is start with an introduction with what, where and when, and rule 2 is highlight the key features with data in the main body paragraph. So let's look at this sample answer again. Have you noticed how each of the statements in bold are backed up with data? For example, we don't just say by 1990 the figure had more than doubled, we also say by how much, from 5 million to 11 million. So if you look at these sentences from our sample answer, you can see the different ways you can back up your statements with data. For example, we can put brackets around the figure, either within a sentence or at the end of a sentence, or we can use a relative clause. Note that a comma is used before and after. But in reality, prepositions like by and to are probably the easiest way of expressing figures, and we will look at these in more detail in a minute. But what about fractions? What does more than doubled mean? Well, it means increased by more than 50%. And there are a number of ways of expressing numbers in English. For example, 50% could be a half, or even 1 in 2. So you can use fractions to show the size of a change over a period. For example, if viewing figures have decreased by 50%, you could say figures have halved. Or if the number of people studying online rose by a quarter, you could say the numbers studying rose by 25%. If you want to get a good score in lexical resource, it's important that you can express numbers and figures in a variety of ways. The chart in our first sample question had very convenient numbers, but the charts in the IELTS test may not always show figures that are exact or easy to convert into fractions. So if you look at our second example in your Masterclass pack, you can see that this contains a lot of information and that the majority of the values fall above or below the lines. So my first question for you is, what percentage of 16 to 24-year-olds used the internet in October 2000? Well, the answer is 70%. Now, my second question, what percentage of those aged 16 to 24 used the internet in October 2005? Is this an exact percentage? No. The answer is almost 90%. So what about 61% and 23%? How could you express these values differently to boost your score? Well, for 61%, you could say just over 60%. And for 23%, you could say just under a quarter or almost 25%. So just under and almost are examples of ways you can say a number that is not exact. And we call this the language of approximations. Now remember, it's vital you never guess the value or percentage in the test, and also never spend time in the test figuring out what the value is. It is an English test after all, and not a maths test. So if the value is just under 50%, you can say almost or nearly 50%. If it's just above 50%, you can say around or about 50%. And you can use approximately or roughly for figures that are both under and over. So if you want to practice this, pause the presentation and ask yourself these questions. So did you get the answers? The answer to question 1 is just over 50%. The answer to number 2 is almost, around, or approximately 50%. And the answer to number 3 is around or about 70%. So if you want some more practice reading and analysing another dynamic chart, pause the presentation. Here are some more true and false questions you can answer.
Let's go back to the graphs about Japanese tourists again and take a closer look at the prepositions. As you can see, we have used prepositions a lot in our sample answer to introduce a new trend and also to back up our statements with data. These little words can often be really tricky for my students. They identify key features, write a perfect introduction, but then when writing the main paragraph, they use the wrong preposition. Being confident in using them is really important if you want a good score in grammatical range and accuracy. For example, what's the difference between museum visits rose to 50%, museum visits rose from 50%, museum visits rose by 50%? The orange line is rose to 50%, the silver line is rose from 50%, and the blue line is rose by 50%. So if you make a mistake using the prepositions, it changes the whole meaning of your sentence. The prepositions between and also and are used to show the time period. Something happened between one point in time and another point in time. The preposition at is used to incorporate data that stays the same during a particular period of time or is located at one particular point. For example, at the beginning or end of a graph. The prepositions by and off are used to incorporate data to show how much something has increased or decreased. That is, the difference between two amounts of data. For example, if the production of paper fell from 50% to 30%, then we can say that production decreased by 20%, or there was a decrease of 20% in production. Don't forget that by is used after a verb, decreased, while off is used after a noun, a decrease. If you want some practice using prepositions, pause the presentation. Lastly, don't forget that to introduce trends which are related to time, you need to use some of the same prepositions. For example, in 1995, at 6 p.m, in the evening, during the period, by 2017. The last thing we need to consider when writing our Task 1 answer about dynamic charts is varying the sentence structure. As Dawn said earlier, you're marked on both grammatical accuracy, essentially the number of error-free sentences your answer has, and grammatical range. Do you use both simple and complex sentences? Complex sentences are sentences with more than one clause, linked by while, who, although, which, etc. Can you use a range of appropriate structures like active and passive? Can you vary your sentence structure? This is important for the IELTS test, but also if you're writing any kind of academic report. It would get boring and repetitive if you use the same structure for every sentence. These are the most common ways to vary your sentence structure when describing trends or features in dynamic charts. What's the difference in structure between production decreased by 20% or there was a decrease of 20% in production? The first construction is using there plus the verb to be plus an adjective plus a noun and a preposition in and a noun phrase. For example, there was a slight drop in the percentage of visitors. The second structure is noun phrase plus verb plus adverb. For example, after which the number increased steadily. So let's practice. Pause the presentation and answer the following questions. Here are the answers. Did you get them all? Here are a couple of slides on useful vocabulary you can use to describe trends and changes. 25% of your marks in Task 1 are for vocabulary, and a lot of the words we use to describe dynamic charts are not everyday ones. So you need to become familiar with them. But I tell my students not to worry about learning all of them. Just learn a few of them and then practice using them correctly. The IELTS writing test is not the place to start experimenting with words. Remember the 100% rule. Only use a word if you're 100% sure of its meaning, spelling and grammatical use. But remember, not all verbs can be made into nouns. For example, to bottom out or saw. You can't have a bottom out or a saw. For more information, have a look at the handout in your Masterclass pack. To finish the section, here's a slide on comparing data. Don't forget that for a Task 1 question, you must make comparisons where relevant. If you look in your pack, you have some handouts which will help you review the vocabulary and key phrases you need. So in summary, these are the 8 things you need to ask yourself when writing your main paragraph, because if you don't do one or more of them, your score will be lower. Why not look at a piece of your writing and use it to assess how well you have done these 8 things? So over to Jane to talk about the 3rd rule of writing.
So the 3rd rule for your Task 1 answer is the overview. And you must always write one because it is a summary of the most important message from your graph, chart or diagram. And it should be written in 1 or 2 sentences. You can write it after the introduction or the conclusion. It doesn't matter where it appears, but it must be there. If you write it after the introduction, it can also be useful in signalling what you will write about in the main details paragraph. So here's an example of an overview. Notice the word in bold, overall. This signals to the examiner that this is your overview. The skill of writing an overview is also assessed in the task achievement scale, so it's one of the first things an examiner looks for. So let's do another practical exercise using the band descriptors for Task 1. So what's the highest score for a task achievement if you don't include an overview in your answer? Have a look at your band descriptors sheet in your Masterclass pack. Will you get a band 7 if you don't include an overview in your answer? No. Band 7 says, presents a clear overview. What about a band 6? No. Again, we can see, presents an overview. You have to go all the way down to band 5, which says, recounts detail mechanically with no clear overview. Writing an overview doesn't have to be difficult. Just imagine you're writing an executive summary for your busy boss who says, I don't have time to read your report, just tell me the main things I need to know. Thinking this way stops you looking at all the data and focuses your mind on picking out the most important points. So your overview has to be short and with no data. To find the main trend in your graph or your chart, ask yourself, if the graph or chart shows a time period, for example years, look for the overall change from the first year to the last year, or do the values fluctuate? Ignore the individual figures that don't fit the trend. For example, if a graph shows a rising trend overall, you can ignore a specific year where the figures decreased. Save that for your details paragraph. Don't look for individual highest or lowest figures, such as a peak or a low on a line graph. Instead, describe the highest and lowest items overall. For example, which line on the graph was the highest for the whole or most of the period? When we look at static charts with no time periods, you can't look for trends. Instead, you need to look for the most noticeable differences and similarities between items, and also look for what are the highest and lowest values. So lastly, if you're given a table with lots of information in columns or rows, it can be quite daunting to identify the overall feature. So one tip is to look for the row or the column that is the total of all the others, and this is normally at the bottom or the right-hand side of the table. So that's the 3 rules of writing for a dynamic chart. So let's go back to Don to talk about the common mistakes for writing Task 1.
Let's sum up. Sometimes people make these mistakes, and the first one is, as I said, not using figures. Don't make that mistake. The second mistake they make is, as I said then, they describe every detail. Choose the main features. Sometimes a person will do a very clever thing, but a bad thing in IELTS writing. They will say, in the year 2000, a lot of people went to the cinema. It must have been because the weather was very bad. They could not go to the beach, so they went to the cinema. That's clever, but it's a bad answer. Is there any information about the beach or the weather? No. So don't say that. Don't interpret the information. As I said before, a lot of people will write a good essay but forget to bring it together in an overview. Don't do that. Now, sometimes the academic task one is not a graph. It's not a chart. It is a description of a process. A process. For example, how to make sushi. Who cooks here? Put your hand up. Nobody cooks. Do you eat? Ah, very good, you cook. What's your favourite thing to cook?
Just about anything.
Just about anything, very good. Let's say, for example, you like fried rice, okay? Who likes fried rice? Very good. I'll talk to you. Fried rice. First of all, you steam the rice and you cut up some vegetables. Tell me if I'm doing this correctly, right? Then you heat some oil, then you put the onions and things in the oil, and then you chop up some whatever it is that you're going to put into the fried rice. Then you fry it, right? Then you put some spices in, right? I'm a good cook, aren't I? Very good cook. My wife doesn't agree. These are the stages of a process. Your overview for this type of task is there are 5 stages in cooking fried rice, and they involve cutting up and cooking. Very good. That's an overview. So think about that. I'll give you a task. When you go home tonight and you cook in English. First, I am going to do this. Then I'm going to do this. After that, I will do that. And finally, I will do this. You are practicing academic task 1 writing. You're also practicing for your speaking test as well. Because in a speaking test, you might be asked, how do you do that? What do you like to do in the kitchen?
So now let's practice analysing a real process question. You have this in your Masterclass handout. One of the most challenging things about answering process questions is writing about something, often quite technical, that you have never seen or heard of before. But don't worry, the examiner knows that you have probably never seen this process before and is not expecting you to have any prior knowledge of it. And secondly, process questions are actually easier than the other tasks because the vocabulary you need to use is actually on the picture. You don't have to remember using adverbs or verbs of movement, but simply write a report which summarises the sequence. However, as before, don't just jump in and start writing immediately. Take the time to understand the stages of the process by asking yourself these questions. If you want to practice, pause the presentation. So here are the answers. How'd you get on? Don't worry about remembering all of these questions though. Just think of the 3 rules of writing we looked at earlier. These are the same for process questions, except you need to consider what, how and where instead of what, when and where. So the 3 rules of writing are the same. Step 1, write the introduction, where you paraphrase the question, and you write what the process is about, how it works and where it takes place. But what words would you use in your introduction? Let's look at the question again. The question says, the diagram on the right shows the process by which bricks are manufactured for the building industry. What words do you think you could change? Think about the synonyms you could use for diagram. What about a synonym for shows? manufacture, or building. Can you notice how we've substituted picture for diagram? We've used outlines instead of shows. We've used made instead of manufactured. And we've also used the word construction instead of building. Would you have written the same? So what's the second stage to writing your task one answer for a process? Yes, you're right. It's write the main body paragraph. So think about the answers to the earlier questions for your plan. The main body paragraph is where you write about what happens in each stage. Is anything added? Is anything taken away? Does it result in anything? And also, what happens next? So exactly as Don did when he described cooking fried rice, you need to use sequencing words to introduce each stage of the process and also to show the order of the process. Words such as the ones highlighted: first, next, then, lastly. If you missed out a stage or put the steps of a process in the wrong order, would it still work? For example, would the clay still turn into bricks if the sand and water were left out, or if it was put in the oven first? No, the answer is no. So how well you do this is assessed using the second assessment column, coherence and cohesion. You must use a range of linking words such as these, but please be careful not to overuse them. So this was a good paragraph because it was logically ordered, but what is missing? Yes, the data. Always highlight each stage with figures. Remember, in any task one question, there is always data to include. It may be given in percentages or numbers, as in the other graphs we looked at before, or the data in this task is in temperature and time. Look at the figures in blue, 24 and 48 hours, and 200 degrees C. So what else did you notice about the grammar? Did you notice the use of the present passive? The new bricks are dried, and the finished bricks are packed and transported. This is a man-made process, and the person doing the action is not known or important, so you need to use the passive voice. And also, why are we using the present passive? It's because there's no time period mentioned, and it's a process, so it's cyclical, ongoing, and factual. So to finish our answer, we need an overview, which is a clear general summary of the process in a couple of sentences with no data. And it should start with a signposting word, such as overall. You need to think about including the number of stages. The key stages should be mentioned in the right order, and you also should mention what is happening at the beginning and at the end of this process, as in the sample one here. So far in this masterclass, we have practiced analysing dynamic charts and looked at a process, but there is another type of question which is less common but does occur occasionally. So this is a map of a place showing the changes that have taken place to the town of Frenton. If you want to refer to it in the next part of the masterclass, you have a copy of this in your pack. Again, if you look at the instructions, it says the same thing. You need to select and report the main features and make comparisons where relevant, which for a map question means you need to identify the main changes over time, compare and contrast these changes, and also give an overall summary. In addition, to achieve a high band score, examiners are also looking for the following. They're looking for specific vocabulary relating to change, use of the passive voice to describe the changes, and also correct use of prepositions and adverbs relating to location. For example, opposite, between, to the north of, to the south of, in the centre of, etc. So what do you do first? Yeah, that's right. Always analyse the question before writing. So if you want to practice analysing a map, answer these true or false questions. Did you spot the overview? It's in sentence 9. Did you see the verb tenses we used? It's a mixture of past simple, present perfect passive, and past perfect passive. Did you see the prepositions of location that we mentioned before? For example, in the centre of, to the east of. This is the data that you need to put in your main body paragraph. Also, look at the vocabulary. We used built, become, and constructed. This is all vocabulary you need to describe change. The next 4 slides tell you how to improve your task 1 score, from task achievement, grammatical range and accuracy, lexical resource, and coherence and cohesion. You have these in your handouts. So don't forget that an IELTS 7 or higher represents thousands of hours of learning and using English. So take a long-term approach, and in the weeks before the test, try to do some general writing practice as well as some specific writing practice for Task 1 and Task 2. To practice writing your general writing skills, write something in English every day. Even the physical activity of holding a pen and writing on a piece of paper is important because we spend so much time nowadays using a keyboard to write. So you could write a shopping list or you could write a letter. How about reading a newspaper or a magazine article? Take notes and then write a summary. Or practice doing a dictation with a friend. Ask your friend to read a text slowly and write what your friend dictates to you. And when you have finished writing, you could correct your mistakes. Maybe practice speed writing to help you write more quickly. To do this, copy a page of text for 10 minutes. Don't worry about making mistakes, just keep on writing. And then after you have finished, you can check your writing with the original text. Count the number of words and the mistakes you make, and keep a diary with this information. As you practice, you will find that the number of errors you make will decrease, and the number of words you write will increase. Try to practice writing Task 1 every day. Some newspaper and magazine articles have graphs, tables or diagrams, similar to those you will see in your writing Task 1. And you can use them to practice planning and writing your Task 1 answers. Also, using an actual answer sheet will give you an idea of how much you need to write and will also save you time counting words in the exam. So myself, Don and Celine hope you have found this webinar on writing Task 1 useful. Don't forget to check out our Instagram posts and look out for other masterclasses on the IDP Essentials YouTube channel for more essential advice on how to prepare for an IELTS test. Best wishes.